Hi everybody, and welcome to another video where I try to make your life easier when it comes to openings and opening variations, so-called simplified openings. In this video, I will try to give you some interesting ideas against one of the toughest openings for white to meet in modern practice, and that is the Grunfeld defense. Now, the Grunfeld is a very good opening for black, provided that black doesn't mind memorizing a lot of forcing and semi-forcing variations and remembering all the various attempts that white can try against this opening. If those conditions are met, then the black player can confidently play the Grunfeld and hope to score pretty well with this dynamic opening. Now, when it comes from white's perspective, it's a tricky opening because all the wide array of options and variations that white has against it, at first sight they look tempting, that surely there must be something in one of them, but modern theory has proven that that's not really the case. So the modern way of tackling or approaching the Grunfeld has been based on more like one game ideas, where white players look for interesting ideas, rare moves in practically all the lines that can be played against the Grunfeld, and then they try them in one game, and then they know that after that game that idea will be neutralized, so they look for another idea and so forth. So in this video I will try to give you a kind of a more uniform approach, because what I will try to do is to use the ideas that I presented already in my simplified opening series in one of my earlier videos, where I proposed a way to tackle the Catalan opening. So you can browse in my channel and find this video. I think it will be a useful preparation for this one to watch it, because in that video I proposed the move c5 against the Catalan, transforming the position into one akin to the Tarrasch defense, where black accepts an isolated pawn on d5 in exchange of active play. I also spiced up that transformation with this little move h6 used by Magnus Carlsen. So please take a look at that video, because you will find a lot of similarities to the one that you're watching now, and also a lot of the ideas that can be used from there and applied here. So by now you already have, some idea what I'm going to try to show you here, and that is treating the Grunfeld in the Tarrasch way. So how does that happen? So let's start. d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, d5, knight f3, bishop g7, and now the move e3. So basically what we're trying to do is to go bishop e2, short castle, and the typical Grunfeld way after short castle bishop e2 is to immediately attack the center with c5. A move like c6 is possible, obviously, but it's not quite in the Grunfeld spirit. It's the so-called Schlechter defense of the Slav. It's a combination of the Grunfeld and the Slav, but I don't think it's the happiest combination, because there is little point in the bishop being developed on g7 when d4 is well protected. Yeah, so okay, after c6 just some castle, and generally white gets good play by some advance on the queen side, something like b4, a4, b5, and so forth. One great predecessor of ours played a fantastic game and against another great predecessor of ours, and that game featured the move d takes c4, bishop takes c4, and now the move c5. This is a slight modification of the main move c5, and the game I'm talking about is the very famous fifth game of the World Championship match between Petrosian and Botvinnik, played in 1963. Now, if you don't want to be bothered, you can simply play h3 and transpose to the lines we're going to take a look at, but if you're a bit more ambitious, you can go d5 as Petrosian, and after e6, okay, bishop g4 is another alternative. Let's say short castle, then h3, take the bishop on f3. Black establishes blockade on d6, but white has some space advantage thanks to this pawn on d5. So Botvinnik played d6, and after d takes e6, takes on d1, king d1, bishop e6, f takes e6, king e2. White has the slightly better endgame that he magnificently converted. Worth noting in this game was this maneuver knight g5, knight e4, establishing a knight on the untouchable e4 square. Take a look at that game because it's a very nice demonstration of how white should play this endgame, and generally a very good game for chess understanding. So Petrosian Botvinnik, fifth game of their match in 1963. But the Grunfeld player would normally play c5. Yeah, attacking the center, and now we don't react, we go castle, and after c takes d4, e takes d4, knight c6, we arrive at the reversed Tarrasch, where, playing white, white has an extra tempo. And now, going back to this video that I mentioned a bit earlier, my suggestion against the Catalan, which featured the move h6 for white, we will use that idea and play h3 here for white. I mean h6 for black and now h3 for white. A useful move because in these IQP positions with the pawn on d4, and the move bishop g4 is usually important idea to attack that knight that is covering the bishop, the pawn on d4. So by playing h3, we rob black of the access to the g4 square. Now, generally, there are two main lines for black, and this is another good point of playing this variation because, okay, obviously there will be no advantage here for white, but white will get a game, active game, as usually is the case, active pieces in exchange for an isolated pawn on d4. So it's more like of a system rather than a one game surprise. And if you like these positions, you can just play this without too much theoretical knowledge, and this is aided by the fact that, like I said, black has basically two or maybe even, okay, two main, let's say, moves in from this position, and then one of the moves also forks into two more options afterwards. So in total, three main lines that you should need to probably know a bit better than the rest. So in this position, the two main moves are taking on c4 and playing b6. The other moves, for example, bishop e6, can be met by c5, a standard move for black in the Tarrasch, here for white, c5, and the point being that white wants to go something like bishop b5, perhaps to take this knight, establish control over the e5 square, bishop f4, and so forth. Yeah. So it's one idea. For example, knight e4, bishop b5 now. Yeah. These types of positions, they occur frequently in the Tarrasch, and they are quite complex strategically. So obviously it is something that white should be content entering. Similar is bishop f5, when again c5 is a good option. Yeah, and if let's say b6, bishop b5, immediately attacking the knight, then the queen can go to a4. White has good play on the queen side. So let's turn our attention to the let's say main lines, and let's start with the move b6. Yeah. And now white plays in exactly the same way that black plays against the plan of the fianchetto of the queen's bishop, but thanks to the extra tempo, white will also have some extra possibilities. So knight e5, immediately going after that knight that is not defended anymore, bishop b7, and now bishop f3. You should probably remember this sequence because it's kind of a tactical in its nature. The knight and the bishop are targeting the knight on c6, thus preventing d takes c4, because then the knight on c6 is hanging. So knight f5 is now played, defending the bishop on b7 and intending to take on c4. Rook e1, this is again tactical, stopping d takes c4 because bishop takes b7, knight b7, knight c6. Now we see the idea of rook e1, which is to attack the pawn on e7. Therefore, black goes rook c8, covering the c6 square. Yeah, and now b3. So defending the pawn on c4, d takes c4, bishop takes b7, knight takes b7. And now we can come to a fork in the road because the standard move is b takes c4, and we will look at it. But white has an additional very interesting option, and that is the move d5. And the idea is again targeting the weak c6 square. So for example, c takes b3, knight c6 is already bad because there is a weakness of the e7 pawn. And the other lines are also quite sharp. So for example, rook e8, defending the pawn on e7, knight c6, queen d7, knight d5, queen d8. This is a possible repetition if white wants it, but white is obviously not forced to do so. He can go queen f3, and after c takes b3, a takes b3, actually he has quite good compensation. The pawn on a7 is hanging, the c6 square is also always available. The bishop can be developed to d2 to f4 depending on circumstances. That it's still a pretty much playable position for white. So that's, for example, rook e8, and more interesting stuff. For example, if e6, undermining the pawn on d5, yeah, knight c6, and now black should play the very difficult move, if not prepared, queen e8, yeah, because queen d7 is met by bishop a3, attacking the rook, and rook fe8 and bc4 with quite a strong initiative. And after queen e8, bishop a3, even though there are alternatives, I mean, white can take bc4, white can play bishop g5, you can explore these on your own. I'll just show you just, let's say, the main line, bishop a3, knight c5 now, take on c5, take on c5, take on a7, go back to c6 again with pretty unclear position. Yeah, so this is like some of the options, yeah, that white has at his disposal after d5. So check these if you want more dynamic, more tactical play. But the standard move with b takes c4, knight a5 now. This is again the same play as in the Tarrasch, but with colors reversed. Bishop a3, targeting the pawn on a7, so black cannot take on c4 because knight c4, and then bishop is attacking the pawn on e7. So rook e8 defending the pawn, and now c5. Now if you want to really check some Tarrasch history, you can check the game Larsen-Kasparov, very nicely won by Kasparov from this exact position, but with the black pieces, with that pawn being already back on h7, okay, since he was black. Tarrasch defense was Kasparov's main defense prior to his matches with Karpov, so he won a nice game against Larsen after this move, in that case c4 and here c5. And again, here we have like some options that we can consider, but for example, if b takes c5, bishop takes c5, and this position where white has this IQP but very active pieces is also dynamically balanced. Let's say knight d7, queen d7, rook c1, yeah, and this very strong position in the center on the dark squares gives white good dynamic chances and compensation for this isolated pawn. Another option is the move knight d5, now queen f3, targeting f7, yeah, and now if knight c3, unfortunately queen f7, king h8 doesn't work, so simply queen takes c3, and bc5, bishop c5 is similar to what we looked at. Yeah. And the third option, knight d7, undermining this knight on e5. And now again, there are two interesting options. One is queen f3, the other one is queen e2, and it can get very sharp also and dangerous for black. Let's say queen e2, bc5, rook ac1, yeah, and now it's getting very dangerous. C takes d4, knight f7, and it's a very long line. I will quickly show it to you, rather forcing, where white ends up with a extra pawn in a queen endgame. Okay, so imagine a queen endgame from this position. Yeah, so king f7, check on e6, king f8, knight e4. So another, there are options like knight g5. Oops, knight g5 is a threat, but also there is a hidden threat like if bishop h6, preventing knight g5, knight f6. Now this is a very nice move. Yeah, don't forget this, that the pawn on e7 is pinned. So if knight f6, bishop rook c8 first, queen c8, bishop e7 check, king g7, bishop f6 check, go back, another check on e7, now check on e5, now check on d5, king h8, now bishop f6, forcing the exchange of bishops. And after the exchange of bishops, white picks up the pawn on d4, and with checks he will also pick up the knight on a5. So king g8, take on e8, queen d5, and queen a5. Yeah, so very long variation, ending in an extra pawn in a queen endgame for white. So that's let's say one of the possibilities after queen e2. The other one is queen f3, targeting the pawn on f7. So black takes on e5, d takes e5, bc5, rook a d1. It's a pawn sacrifice, queen b6, knight d5, queen e6, and something like, let's say, queen e4. And again, good compensation, because the pawn, the knight, and the queen, and the rooks in the center are giving white very good central dominance, and basically dominating black's pieces, because the bishop on g7 is quite passive. The knight on a5 literally has almost no squares to go to, because going to c6 drops the pawn on c5, for example. Yeah, and there is also pressure on the pawn on c5, so this like domination and then big presence of pieces in the center gives white compensation for the pawn. So a lot of complicated lines, a lot of interesting lines, dynamic possibilities that in both lines here after knight b7, both d5 and bc4 give white some active play. So this is the line after ninth move b6. Now let's move to the other one, and that's d takes c4. Yeah. So black is creating immediately a IQP on d4. Now, of course, bishop c4 is the natural move, but you can also try the pawn sacrifice d5, knight a5, b4, c b3, a b3, and let's say bishop f5. Now this is a small trick, because b4 does not, unfortunately, win a piece, because the knight has no squares to go to because of the move queen c8, counter-attacking the knight on c3 and allowing knight c4. So it's a small trick, but white can avoid it with bishop d2, and now b4 really is a threat. And this is a sharp position, again, a pawn sacrifice, but good compensation, because the knight can't really get back into the game. And black must always be aware how not to lose that knight. Yeah? And there are also like ideas like knight d4, hitting that bishop on f5, or moving the knight from c3, targeting the knight on a5. And yeah, I mean, it definitely should be explored further if you feel like playing this. So that's the pawn sacrifice d5, but bishop c4 obviously is the automatic move, yeah, recapturing the pawn. And now, like I mentioned, here again, there is a fork in the road. One idea is to go b6 and bishop b7, and the other one is to go knight a5. So two more, let's say, main lines, yeah, from this position. So let's start with b6, yeah. Again, the idea is to develop the bishop in the fianchetto. And now, for example, the engine suggests the move knight e5. Okay, but the problem with this move is that basically leads to more or less like a dead equal endgame after queen takes d4. Yeah, and now you can take on f7 if you want. Let's say bishop f7, rook f7, knight c6, but queen d7, and it's basically equal. White has the better pawn structure. This pawn on e7 is isolated, but black also has the pair of bishops. Or you can take on c6, yeah, take on c4, take on e7, take on c8, and again, rook c8, bishop e3. It's pretty dead equal. Therefore, after b6, yeah, rook e1 is a natural move, bishop b7, and now again, very interesting idea for white, b3. The idea is to again target after bishop a3 that pawn on e7. So rook e8, natural to kind of get away from the sensitive diagonal, bishop a3. And now again, there are a lot of interesting and sharp lines. I will show you a few. Let's say e6, getting away from the, removing the pawn from the sensitive square and blunting this bishop on c4. But the problem with that move is that after some knight b5, there is a weakening of the d6 square. So for example, if knight b5, the only move is bishop f8. Yeah, and after bishop f8, rook f8, the engine claims that black is fine, but there is still some sensitivity about this king on g8. A more complex option is queen d2 instead of knight b5, knight a5, bishop drops back to e2 to cover the knight on f3. Yeah, rook c8, and now rook a d1. And again, it's pretty complex, yeah. The move knight b5 still is on the menu, targeting the d6 square, but also with this concentration on the d file and the knight on c3, the move d5 becomes an option. So just to show you, knight drops back to c6, knight b5, intending knight d6, bishop f8, takes on f8, rook f8, and d5 now. And it's becoming again very dangerous for black. Let's say knight d5, queen g5, yeah, threatening stuff like knight g5 and mating because this knight is pinned. Queen f6, yeah, defending, but now knight d6. Yeah, so attacking the rook and the bishop, rook b8 and bishop c4. So you see, it's like all sorts of threats are happening. Yeah, maybe even, I don't know, rook e4, then swing the rook and so forth. This is quite dangerous for black. And if black takes with the pawn, then queen f4. Yeah, again, very good compensation. The d6 square is always vulnerable. Knights can start jumping and go to h2 to g4, maybe to target this knight. And if an exchange happens, the bishop can target the rook. So a lot of tactical options for white. So after bishop a3, a6 is another move that I looked at. It makes sense, stopping knight b5. Yeah. Now rook c1, and now again I will show you a very interesting line after b5, because if e6, for example, it's probably safer, but black still needs to be very careful after d5. And I'll show you a kind of again semi-forcing line, exchanges on d5, knight d5, e d5, queen d5, take on e1, take on e1, take on d5, bishop d5, and this seemingly it's equal, but black has problems. Yeah, I mean, with very precise play he can hold, but there is a problem with the pinned knight, and there is also a problem with the f7 pawn. So knight g5 is a problematic move. Yeah. So just to show you some line there where black needs to be super precise. Let's say rook d8, natural to attack the bishop, but now knight g5. Yeah. The bishop cannot be taken because there is always rook e8. And if bishop f6, only move, knight e4 now, attacking the bishop. Bishop e5, f4 now. Yeah. And if bishop f4, rook f1, and f7 is problematic. Yeah. And the prettiest line, taking the bishop on d5, is met by knight f6, winning the rook, because bishop f6 leads to a standard like nice mating pattern. Check on e8, king g7, bishop f8, king g8, and bishop h6 mate. So you see, it's far from simple, this seemingly simple looking endgame. Yeah, that's for example e6, and in case of b5, bam, on f7. Yeah, take on f7, king f7, and d5. A very surprising piece sacrifice, and it's based on the fact that after knight a7, check on g5, king g8, knight e6, queen d7, knight c5, white is actually very safe because queen c7, knight e6 is a repetition. But he's not forced to repeat. He can go knight 3 e4, and after take knight e4, rook e4. It's a very surprising compensation for white because all his pieces are well placed. The idea is somewhat positional. Go to knight e6, attack the queen, take that bishop on g7, and then go bishop b2, queen d4, and attack along the long diagonal. And black's main problem is that he's basically, even though he has an extra piece, he's playing without that knight on a7. It's completely out of the game, so it doesn't even count. So another interesting idea for white in this line. So there's the move b3, and very interesting, I think, idea, yeah, in this position where normally bishop f4 would be the move to be played, but black should be able to control that. But b3 and bishop a3 quite exciting. And now let's turn our attention to the last move, knight a5, attacking the bishop on c4, bishop goes back to d3, bishop e6, and rook e1. And now again, a standard typical idea for black there, white here, in black in the Tarrasch, is that whenever we have a rook on the e-file and a bishop on e6, there it's on e3, the exchange sacrifice rook e6 must be taken into consideration. So to show you, rook c8, rook takes e6, f takes e6, and knight g5. And again, it's surprising how problematic this is for black. Yeah, let's say queen b6. Okay, queen b6 or queen d7. Let's say queen d7. This is even more typical because even in the end game, you see how black suffers. Queen e2, knight c6, queen e6 check. Yeah, and queen e6, knight e6, rook e8, and now a very nice move, bishop c2. So the idea is to go bishop b3, not having an exposed bishop on c4. Yeah, then go bishop d2, rook e1, and it's amazing how black cannot untangle. This knight on e6 is a beast. Controls the rooks and dominates the rooks. Yeah, the rook on e8 doesn't have squares to go to, and the rook on c8 similar. Yeah, so this is just one sample line where white has compensation even in the end game thanks to this monster knight on e6. There are also other lines. You can check them yourselves. Yeah, but this is just an illustration of the power of this exchange sacrifice. Now if black avoids it, for example, with bishop c4, it's not quite good, because the bishop c4, knight c4, queen e2, it's actually a double attack. The knight is hanging, and also the pawn on e7 is hanging. So the best move for black is to drop back to c6. Now taking on a6 doesn't quite work, because then black is more compact. The knight is closer to c6, and the rook is not really necessary on c8. Yeah? And now two, let's say, options for white. One is queen c2, bishop c2, removing the bishop and defending the knight on d4. Yeah, let's say queen d6, intending to put the rook on d8 and continue the attack on the pawn on d4. Bishop g5, developing, rook a d8, and now bishop b3, attacking the bishop on e6. And after the exchange on b3, queen b3, what white is aiming for is to exchange the IQP for a pawn on the queen side. Yeah, so black takes on let's say on d4, then white takes on b7 or maybe on e7. But especially in cases when he takes on the queen side, he's hoping to make something with the queen side majority. Okay, then we have 2 pawns against 1, and normally these 2 would be easier to advance, because black finds it more difficult to advance these 4 pawns in the center. So that's one idea for white. And another one, again taken from the Tarrasch defense, bishop e3, knight d5, and queen d2. So the idea is to go bishop h6 and exchange this bishop on g7, and after knight e3, f takes e3. So this pawn transformation is quite typical for the Tarrasch defense. The pawn structure is changed. Instead of an IQP, now we have this central pawn duo, e3 and d4. So there is no more isolated pawn on d4. It's no longer weak. And white in this case can play, thanks to this good central control that these pawns allow for. For example, bishop e4, placing the bishop on this diagonal, maybe rook c1, maybe going for a knight on c5, knight e4, knight c5, or knight a4, knight c5. Maybe the f file can also be used. And, well, basically very stable position in the center, and a complex, obviously, still middle game ahead. So there you go. That was the way how you can use these ideas from the Tarrasch defense to tackle the Grunfeld. I will again say there is no advantage for white here, except for the, let's say, some of the lines where black makes some mistake or in precision. But generally, it's just an idea how you can, let's say, meet this popular opening without having to study a lot of theory. And especially useful if you, for example, you've seen this video against the Catalan that I mentioned, so you already know some of these ideas in the similar positions with an IQP, or you play the Tarrasch with the black pieces. Then you should find really playing these positions easy, natural, and quite practical, I would say, because we know that there's a lot of theory out there, so we want to cut down on that. Okay, so thanks for watching this one, ladies and gentlemen. Make sure you kaboom, smash that subscribe button, like the video, comment on it, subscribe to my Substack, and again, don't forget, if you become paid subscribers to my Substack, you should get in touch with me and tell me which opening you would like to analyze on my channel, or which positions or your games if you want analyzed, your style, weaknesses, strengths, pretty much anything that you would like seen on the channel. So thanks again, and hope you enjoyed this. I did, analyzing these ideas, and I'll see you again soon. Take care.